121 snakes in the grass. The gorilla HALLOW subordinates nervously surrounded them to cut off any avenue for retreat. He towered over the unimpressed Suruxi. "You dare look down on Gargantua?" he bellowed. Hisashi could barely restrain an eye roll. He's even speaking in the third person. He doesn't even realize he is an ant when compared to even the weakest members of Las Noches. Drunk on what little power he has been able to gather out here in the middle of nowhere, he thought. Suruxi looked at Gargantua like one would look at a bug they were planning to step on. As if his mere presence disgusted her. Knowing her proclivities, she might actually step on him while whipping him, Hisashi thought. "Are you not going to kneel?" she asked, enraging him even further. "You will pay for your arrogance," Gargantua said. He cocked back his massive fist and swung. Suruxi didn't even dodge. Instead, she simply raised her Zanpakuto using the sharp disc portion to deflect his punch. Despite his size compared to her, she didn't even budge when his fist collided with her Zanpakuto. "Is that all you've got?" she said. The surrounding Ajuches were staring between the two parties, unsure as to what they should do. They might have submitted to Gargantua, but that was only because he was the strongest and cruelest Ajuches around. They weren't so sure he was the stronger party anymore though. "Kill them all," he shouted. This caused them to break out of their stupor and look over at Hisashi and Mila Rose instead. Hisashi and Mila Rose weren't concerned though. The difference between Ajuches and Vasto Lord was an almost unsurpassable chasm. Despite there being nearly 50 Ajuches facing them, Mila Rose wore an excited, bloodthirsty smile. She crouched ready to pounce. Her claws unveiled themselves from her paws both on her arms and legs. Hisashi simply spread his four-blade arms. With the four of them, he was effectively able to guard against attacks from the complete 360 degrees around him. Since Suruxi was around and someone had likely been following him, he couldn't use his illusions to hide one pair of arms to trick his enemies. Their enemies seemed to draw some kind of confidence from their numbers and attacked both of them. Hisashi danced between his enemies, focusing primarily on dodging. He would stab and slash at some of the many openings he was able to find. This way he was able to slowly whittle down the enemy Ajuches. He was made sure to look like it was a taxing battle to deal with over 24 enemies attacking at the same time, making sure to allow some glancing blows to hit him from time to time and using his illusions to exaggerate the damage those attacks resulted in. It completely looked as if he were actually struggling to handle the Ajuches. Mila Rose was the complete opposite though. She simply went blow for blow with them, tanking the hits she couldn't avoid and making sure to strike back twice as hard. It didn't take long for most of her body to be covered in blood as she used her claws to literally rip and tear her enemies apart one limb at a time. Due to this, Mila Rose came off as the more powerful amongst them, second only to Suruxi, who was still fighting Gargantua. Gargantua frowned. "Only weaklings rely on tools," he spat out. Suruxi sneered. "You are too stupid to even fathom what you're dealing with. My Zanpakuto is no tool. It is a part of my, just as your claws and fangs are part of you. You're weaker than I expected though. I won't even need it to deal with you," she said. He snarled, lifting both his fists up together. He clasped his hands and brought them both down on her from above. She simply lifted her left arm that wasn't holding her Zanpakuto and blocked both his hands with just the strength of her hierro to protect herself. He couldn't even cause a scratch. She shook her head. "See? That's just how weak you are. Now do you realize how futile your actions are? Since you attacked me, some punishment is in order. I might still go easy on you if you grovel a little though," she said. He roared. 3 of his strongest subordinates that had been trying to orchestrate the fights with Mila Rose and Hisashi came running over to help him. "I would expect nothing better from such bottom feeders." "Not that it would make a difference," Suruxi said. Once it was 4-on-1 though, she couldn't stay still anymore and had to start fighting actively. Despite that, she had still left her Zanpakuto on her waist since she had said she didn't need it to deal with them. Since Hisashi was actually having a very easy time with the battle due to his agility, simply putting him in another league, he could easily keep an eye on Mila Rose and Suruxi's battles. Due to this, he noticed a shadowy figure when it appeared at the edge of the clearing. It seemed whatever kind of hollow it was, it had some kind of concealment ability that made it hard to notice unless you were paying close enough attention. It was shrouded in darkness, but he could make out an entirely humanoid shape. "What do we have here? It looks like an arraign car," he mused. He watched it carefully blend into the crowd. Its direction wasn't towards him though. After a few moments it became clear it was moving in Suruxi's direction. Hisashi raised his brow. Well, that's unexpected, he thought. To ensure he could interfere, he carefully manipulated his fight to move closer to Suruxi without anyone noticing what he was doing. Suruxi was too arrogant and distracted by her fight to notice the shadowy figure nearing her. The figure drew back a sharp pointy blade and waited for an opening. When Gargantua along with two of his subordinates attacked her at the same time, it saw its chance and pierced towards Suruxi's head. Hisashi revealed himself by dashing between them and blocking the strike at the last moment. Now who are you? He asked. 122 wrong place. Once they clashed, the assassin could no longer maintain whatever ability was granting their limited stealth capabilities, and their true form was unveiled. As he had expected, it was indeed an reincarnate. Their almost entirely human-like body with a fragment over their mask covering the lower half of their face gave them away. Their physique was rather small and slender compared to most other male reincarnates he had seen, and their zanpakuto, rather than being in the shape of a katana, was shaped like a rapier ready to pierce anything in its path. Based on their physique, techniques and zanpakuto, Hisashi was fairly certain assassination was their specialty. It would explain the quick drop-off in force the moment he blocked the attack. Relying on stealth, speed and bursts of power rather than sustained strength. Suruxi looked back to find out what the sudden sounds were. Her eyes went wide the moment she saw someone had come within inches of piercing her head if not for Hisashi's interference. She hadn't even noticed their approach. Her eyes darted between the attacker facing her and Hisashi's back as he guarded her. She frowned. Hisashi spun around, parrying the rapier blade by deflecting it to the side and following up with a downward slash that severed the reincarnate's outstretched hand. "Ah!" he screamed out, holding on to the stump that was left of the arm. Given that he was an reincarnate, that would be a much more serious injury than it was to Ajuch's if he had forsaken his regeneration during his transformation, needing outside intervention just to reattach. A moment after he realized his attack failed, he tried to hop backwards out of range, but despite having used two of his arms to block and sever their arm, he still had two more. One of which caught him just below the knee before he managed to get out of range, sending him rolling on the ground. Both sides of the conflict had come to a halt, surprised by the sudden intervention by a third party. Unsure which side they were on, if any. Now that a reincarnate are attacking, none of them can survive. If I don't want this to get back to Las Noches, he thought. He dashed towards where the unknown reincarnate had landed at only a fraction of his top speed, but now that one of their legs was severed, their speed that he already felt lacking had become even less impressive. With one smooth slash he beheaded him, sending their head flying. It seemed their build was an even more extreme version of his own, with everything invested in speed and burst damage. Unfortunately, he came across someone that outclassed him in the very thing he excelled at. Once he lost the element of surprise, he was no more than a sitting duck. Hisashi shook his head. "How disappointing," he said. He looked out into the forest. "Are you going to finally come out?" he asked. There was silence for a few moments. Everyone looked around in confusion, unsure if anyone was actually watching them, let alone where they would be. Suddenly the rumbling sound of sonido echoed across the clearing. Two silhouettes appeared on the top of the temple the Ajuchis had built. Uncaring for the disrespect they were showing the Ajuchis. One was the tall Nnoitra, who was looking down on them with a scowl. A step behind him was his only Frakian, Tesralinda Cruz, a male reincarnate with an eye patch and short sandy blonde hair. Suruxi scowled. "Nnoitra! How dare you!" she screamed. Nnoitra smirked. "Oh, hello there, Suruxi. Unfortunately, you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. No hard feelings," he said carelessly. She gritted her teeth at the disrespect. "What do you think Aizen will say when he finds out you tried to assassinate one of our own?" she asked. Hisashi shook his head. "He isn't planning on letting any of us get back to Las Noches," he said. Nnoitra clapped slowly. "See. He gets it. That's the problem with women. So short-sighted," he said, slowly shaking his head. He sighed. "Such a shame that weakling failed at even completing the one task I gave him. Although you're still the same pathetic mewling quim you've always been, it would have been best if the strongest amongst you could have been picked off before the fight even started. Wouldn't want you escaping and divulging what happened here," he said. He shook his head. "Well, not that it matters that much if a slightly stronger ant partakes. I can still easily crush you all," he said. Suruxi glared at him. "You bastard." She spat out through gritted teeth. Nnoitra made a hand signal and multiple other arrain car showed up surrounding the clearing. I don't recognize any of them. They must be nobodies here to fill the ranks, Hisashi thought. Since Nnoitra only had one member in his Frakian, there were many arrain car eager to join the Frakian of an Espada. Just the possibility alone was enough to motivate them to betray them. As long as Las Noches never found out, it couldn't harm them. Hisashi smiled softly. So, now that you've got us here, isolated, would you be so kind as to tell us what has brought this on? He asked despite knowing exactly what his motivations should be. Nnoitra smirked. It can't be helped. If you weren't part of that bitch's Frakian, maybe you could have been useful minions. I've been waiting a long time for an opportunity. I destroyed her once, then she comes back, and not only has her power been restored, she has a bunch of allies with high potential. That's unacceptable. Unfortunately, my options in Las Noches are limited, he said. He grit his teeth. I thought Ciel Aparo could be useful, but right when he was supposed to make a move, that weakling ran away like a coward. So scared she might come to look for him. I'm not a weakling like him though, he said. Hisashi nodded. I see. Did you ever consider you weren't the only one scheming though? He asked. His mouth slowly formed a smirk. Nnoitra tilted his head in confusion. What? He said. The sound of sonido echoed once again. 123 Hunter or Prey. Nelliel appeared just in front of him as if she were his bodyguard. She glared at Nnoitra. Hisashi smiled. You weren't the only one patiently following us at a distance, he said. He turned to Nelliel and his smile turned slightly sinister. I think your revenge is long overdue, dear, he said. She nodded seriously, not taking her eyes off Nnoitra for even a second. Will you be okay? She asked. The concern was evident in her tone. His smile softened. Of course. Don't worry about me and go all out. Just make sure he doesn't escape, he said. Nnoitra glared back at Nelliel. It doesn't matter. I defeated you once. I can do it again, he said. He didn't seem as confident as he was trying to appear though. Nnoitra swung his crescent-bladed halberd Zanpakuto in frustration, causing the temple they were standing on to shatter into pieces, forcing them to jump down. As soon as he hit the ground, he dashed towards Nelliel. Tessera, let's go, he shouted. Tessera followed close behind him. It seemed despite acting arrogant, he still wasn't willing to take any risks. Nelliel smirked and dashed towards them too. Hisashi looked around, trying to get a better overview of their situation. The arrain car were closing in on them. Meanwhile, the Ajuches still seemed unsure of how to proceed, being stuck between two unknown forces. He wasn't too worried though. They weren't at any real risk. The only risk was revealing too much of his power, which he wanted to avoid. He looked over at Mila Rose and Suruxi. I need you to buy time holding off Nnoitra's backup. Meanwhile, I'll get rid of the rabble and then back you up, he said. Mila Rose fist bumped her chest confidently, causing her breasts to bounce. Leave it to me, she said confidently. Suruxi grimaced slightly, but then let out a sigh. Whatever, she said. Despite her attitude, at least it seemed she had agreed. Hisashi turned to the Ajuches, including the gorilla, with a smirk. Well, I think this will be the end of the line for you, he said. He restricted the speed he moved at to one appropriate for a Vasto Lord, but he was still too fast for them to keep up. Before they realized what had happened, he had already passed through a group of them, sending 4 heads flying with a single swing of each arm. They disappeared quickly, with him consuming the spirit particles remaining within their corpses. The gorilla Ajuche's eyes went wide. Quick, get together. Don't let him slip in again, he shouted in a hurry. They quickly grouped up with their backs facing towards one another, facing out, prepared for any attack he might try. He ran circles around them so fast with their limited perception he was actually forming after images. All of the images had a playful smile. Do you really think that is going to be of any help? His taunting voice echoed from all directions. They couldn't even keep up with him. How were they planning on defending themselves even if they tried to protect each other's backs? Limiting the area they had to defend against. Then one of their heads went flying. The gorilla's fist tightened and he gnashed his teeth. He had been completely helpless to stop it. You've really been overestimating yourselves, Hisashi said. 2 more heads went flying. His system was constantly dinging as he picked them off and was consuming them, but he had minimized it to avoid too many distractions. Even if the Ajuchas posed no risk, even if he let them attack him directly, who was to say none of the Arrancar or worse Nnoitra might not try to attack him while he was distracted. Thinking of yourselves as the rulers of Hueco Mundo, he said. 3 heads went flying. The Ajuchas' heads were nervously darting left and right trying to find the real him. The pressure on them slowly, but steadily mounting. You only have what you've collected so far, because you were too weak to pay attention to, Hisashi said. 4 heads went flying. Almost half of them had already died in just a few short moments, causing panic to spread amongst them. A few tried making a run for it in different directions, but this just sped up their death as it made them the next targets, with their heads being sent flying. What little control the guerrilla Ajuchas had over the group was long gone. More of them tried to escape, even pushing others away, trying to use them as distractions, but it was to no avail, as any who tried to leave died within just a few steps out of the circle they had formed. After a couple had tried, the remaining ones froze, sticking close to their leader. Only a handful remained. The guerrilla Ajuchas looked around nervously. "See, come out and face me, you coward," he shouted and thumped his chest. Another 4 heads went flying before Hisashi came to a standstill in front of him and his few remaining underlings, with the heads of one of the Ajuchas pierced onto his blade arm. He smirked. "Only one of us 2 seems to be cowering," he said. He shook his head. "I think that's been enough playing around though," he said before disappearing. The gorilla Ajucha's expression hadn't even changed as it, along with his other limb, went flying away from his torso within a moment of Hisashi passing by him and his allies. Hisashi didn't hesitate and sat down to focus on quickly consuming their bodies. He looked over at Nelliel's battle. It seemed to be progressing quite evenly despite it being 2 against 1. Should I help her? He wondered. He shook his head. No. This is her chance at punishing Nnoitra for what he did to her, Dondakaka and Pesche. She needs to do this herself. I won't interfere unless I absolutely have to, he thought. Instead, he dashed towards where Mila Rose and Suruxi were still holding off the lower-ranked Arrancar Nnoitra brought with him. 124. I've changed. Nelliel. How dare you show yourself in front of me again? Nnoitra shouted. Nnoitra recklessly swung his Zanpakuto, but Nelliel blocked it effortlessly with her own. He grimaced. Did you really think you could just walk back in like nothing happened? He said. She looked at him with a neutral gaze, ignoring him. You were nothing then and you are nothing now. He shouted even louder. Tessera tried taking advantage of her Zanpakuto being occupied to attack her from the other side, but she flipped over using her clash with Nnoitra as a pivot and kicked Tessera away like an annoying fly, sending him bouncing off the ground until he hit one of the trees lining the clearing. She parried Nnoitra's Zanpakuto to the side and followed up immediately with a swing down at him. He dashed backwards to dodge and was mostly successful. The only thing she managed to cut with his cloth eye patch, causing it to split and fall off, revealing the hollow hole instead of an eye hiding behind it. His eye narrowed as he stared at her cautiously. His gaze shifted to Tessera. Get up, you weakling, he shouted. Tessera struggled to his feet, his legs already shaking just from resisting a single blow. Nnoitra dashed towards Nelliel, swinging his Zanpakuto as hard as he could into her side. She blocked it with her own Zanpakuto, sending her sliding a few steps to the side before coming to a halt. You're too weak, Nnoitra. You always were. Nothing has changed, she said calmly. His gaze sharpened. Tessera disappeared from where he was standing, reappearing behind Nelliel, swinging his Zanpakuto at her back. She easily blocked it by grabbing the blade with her bare hands. Sparks flew where the blade clashed with her hierro. Tessera's hand shook as he struggled to continue his slash, to no avail. It was like he was caught in a vice. Using Tessera's attack as a distraction, Nnoitra quickly swung his Zanpakuto around for a reverse cut, but was blocked once again. He swung again and again, speeding up his attacks, but Nelliel remained unfazed. She swung the hand holding Tessera's Zanpakuto, sending him flying. Nnoitra tisked. Useless. He spat out. He tried surprising her with a kick, but Nelliel leaned forward, allowing it to harmlessly pass over her before swinging around and backhanding him right in the face and sending him tumbling backwards. She followed up with a slash that he barely managed to block with his Zanpakuto due to her breaking his stance, and sent him flying back. He managed to right himself mid-air and landed on his feet. His expression had gotten worse and worse with each clash that ended in his failure. This bitch, he muttered. She appeared in front of him before he could react with a follow-up slash that sent blood flying and left a large gash across his chest. Nnoitra-sama. Tessera shouted and dashed towards them. He wildly slashed at Nelliel. He failed to inflict any damage as she easily blocked him and sent him flying with a punch to the chest. The impact caused him to spit out a mouthful of blood. The attack gave Nnoitra the moment he needed to jump out of range though. Nelliel shook her head. The only way you even managed to beat me last time was through a sneak attack with another Reincar. Do you really think you stand a chance in a direct fight? She asked. Shut up. I'm not the same as I was before. While you spent all that time healing, I grew beyond your imagination, Nnoitra shouted. It doesn't seem like it from where I'm standing, she said dismissively. Tessera appeared behind Nelliel once again, but instead of attacking he grabbed her, trying to hold her in place by her arms. Nnoitra-sama. Now! He shouted. Nnoitra leaned forward and stuck out his tongue with a 5 tattooed on it. Golden particles gathered into a sphere in front of it before firing a golden Sero towards Nelliel. Nelliel opened her mouth. Just before the Sero reached her, it came to a sudden halt as if it hit a wall and slowly decreased in size while she slowly sucked it up into her mouth as if it were some kind of snack. Nnoitra's eye widened. Before he could react, she spat it back out. Ha! She shouted. The golden beam had turned purple, was larger, more powerful, and faster than before as it hurtled right back at Nnoitra. He tried to dodge, but he was too slow, getting hit directly as it blasted him into the forest, leaving a line of destruction into the forest of Menos with shattered and collapsed trees along the way until he finally came to a stop with one final collision, and the energy contained in the beam detonated into a giant explosion with Nnoitra at the center. Tessera froze, his eyes darting between Nelliel and where Nnoitra had gone flying off to. He seemed to hesitate and his grip on her loosened. Nelliel used his moment of distraction to turn and swung her Zanpakuto at him. He realized too late, and despite his best last-ditch effort to dodge, still lost an arm and was sent scrambling back. A few moments later, a far more injured Nnoitra scrambled out of the pile of rubble he was buried under. He swung his arm at the rubble, sending large chunks of it flying away in all directions. He grimaced. Sero Doble. How could I forget? He groaned. He glared at Nelliel, but didn't dive right back into the fight. No, I refuse to stand below you again. I'll show you. You're nothing. I'll show you how I've changed. He shouted. A golden aura enveloped Nnoitra, and the spirit particles in the atmosphere grew excited, swirling around and towards him violently. He raised his Zanpakuto up high. Pray, Santa Teresa. He shouted. A bright golden light burst from the Zanpakuto, blinding them for a moment. 125. It's her fight. Hisashi, Mila Rose and Suruxi had been holding off all the other Reincar all by themselves. Despite being massively outnumbered, they were holding on quite well. Suruxi seemed to hold the upper hand while Mila Rose was on the back foot, but neither were in any immediate danger. Most of them were dealing with Suruxi, who outclassed them as an espada, while Mila Rose dealt with the stragglers. If Suruxi and Mila Rose were more capable of working together, they might have already beaten these failure Reincar that could only hold on through sheer force of numbers rather than any real power or skill. They weren't even strong enough to qualify for a Frakian. That was probably exactly why Nnoitra picked them, though. No one would miss them, so he could just kill all the witnesses after they helped him complete the job. If there were no witnesses, there would be no way for Aizen to find out after all. The fools weren't even smart enough to realize the truth of their situation while they did their best assisting Nnoitra in hopes of a brighter future. Mila Rose smirked when she noticed him. Took you long enough. Were you going to leave all the fun to us? She asked. He chuckled. I was just having a little fun of my own. Worried I would show up too late? He asked. She snorted. You wish, she said. Suruxi frowned, blocking multiple strikes aimed at her. Could you two shut up and help? Am I supposed to be doing everything myself? She asked. Hisashi smirked. I thought you could handle it, he said innocently. She gritted her teeth. Just do something, she retorted. As soon as Hisashi joined Mila Rose, the balance shifted entirely in their favor, as the other Reincar could no longer gang up on her like before and break her rhythm. Over their years spent together, they had long adapted to each other's fighting style. When she advanced, he retreated, and when he advanced, she retreated in return, keeping the many enemies occupied with minimal exhaustion to either of them. Their timing was perfect, leaving minimal openings for their enemies to take advantage of. Only when they were assured they could finish an enemy off did they strike fast and hard. It started slow with the first few, but with every Reincar eliminated, it became easier and easier, causing the next to follow sooner. It didn't take long before Moore needed to abandon the fight with Suruxi to help face the duo, finally giving her a breather. Hisashi looked at Mila Rose as they were dealing with the last few Reincar. "Do you want to eat?" he asked. She shook her head. "I've barely experienced any growth since becoming a Vasta Lord," she said. She smirked. "You're also the biggest glutton out of all of us with how fast you go," she said. He raised his brow. "Are you sure?" he asked. She smiled and nodded. "Well, I'm not going to argue that," he said. He shrugged and quickly started consuming them while they finished off the last few. By that point Suruxi was only dealing with a few herself. Hisashi consumed another of the Reincar. "Do you need any help?" he asked casually. She sent one of her attackers flying his way in retaliation. A single swipe of his blade was enough to finish off the already weakened and disoriented Reincar. He chuckled. "That wasn't very nice," he said. All of them froze on the spot as a giant purple beam blasted through part of the clearing and into the forest. The only exception was Suruxi, who jumped back like a cat that had its tail stepped on. It took a few moments for everyone to realize they survived whatever it was. Suruxi took advantage of their distraction to quickly finish off the few that remained. She let out an exaggerated sigh. "Making me do all the work?" she asked. Hisashi rolled his eyes. "How are you holding up?" he asked with concern. Despite everything, they were allies at the moment and they might need her help depending on how things unfolded after all. Her haughty expression softened ever so slightly. Fine. "I'm fine," she said. Mila Rose chuckled, causing Suruxi to blush, cross her arms under her chest, and look away in embarrassment. A quick look at Nelliel caused her to relax, seeing her holding the upper hand over Nnoitra and Tessera, the last two remaining Reincar present. They were struggling just to keep up with her. Mila Rose turned back to Hisashi. "Go ahead and quickly finish eating them. Nelliel might need our help soon, so you better be ready," she said. He smiled as he started converting the corpses to spirit particles and sucking them up. "I'm always ready," he said. She rolled her eyes. "Sure you are," she said. He sighed. If only Sung Sun was here, he thought melodramatically. They suddenly felt a massive increase in spiritual pressure drawing their attention towards Nnoitra, who had been blasted into the forest by Nelliel's Cerro Doble. The spirit particles in the air were rapidly drawn towards him and he glowed a bright golden that suddenly flashed bright enough to blind them momentarily. When the light receded, his resurrection form was unveiled. He had 6 bone-like arms, 4 of which held large black dual-headed scythes that looked very dangerous. 2 white horns had sprouted from the sides of his head, curving upwards. The bone-like armor had spread to cover most of his body except the middle of his chest and face. Of his clothing only his baggy white pants remained. He swung the scythes with an excited smile as if warming up. Mila Rose looked concerned. She tried to run towards Nelliel. Hisashi blocked Mila Rose with one of his arms. She frowned and trying to get past him. "Why are you stopping me? We need to help her," she shouted. He shook his head. "This is her fight. Don't interfere unless she really can't handle it anymore. It would be best if she can overcome this herself," he said. She looked over at Suruxi for some backup, but she just shrugged, not caring either way. Mila Rose looked back at Nelliel reluctantly, but stopped trying to help. She crossed her arms with a look of dissatisfaction. "You better be right," she mumbled. 126 Vengeance must be served. Nelliel. The moment Nnoitra unsealed his resurrection, she could feel the spirit pressure he was giving off multiply. Where before her own spirit pressure had dwarfed his, he actually exceeded hers by quite a bit now. He dashed towards her, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. He moved so fast he got back to the clearing before she could even react. She barely managed to dodge one of the scythes that came swinging for her neck by jumping back. Tessera was looking at Nnoitra unsurely. Do you need my help?" he shouted. Nnoitra seemed to be too occupied by his rage for Nelliel as he simply ignored his fraction. He swung his 4 scythe blades wildly, purely based on his instincts rather than technique, while wearing a wild smile. It lacked any real pattern, causing Nelliel to struggle to dodge them. It took everything out of her just to be able to barely hold on. Not so high and mighty anymore. "Are you Nelliel?" he sneered. Tessera, seeing his opportunity, joined in on the flurry, and Nelliel was no longer completely able to keep up despite her best efforts to weave between the duo's attacks. Cuts on her clothes and skin started appearing one by one. She did manage to avoid any attacks that posed a more serious threat, such as those targeting her torso and head. Tessera didn't escape unscathed either though. Due to Nnoitra being so caught up in his frenzy of attacks, he wasn't even trying to avoid Tessera, leading to him gaining some injuries too despite being there to help. If it weren't for Nnoitra not intentionally targeting him, he would probably be even worse off. Come on, Nelliel. Keep up. Nnoitra taunted. Nelliel grit her teeth until her gums bled. Being humiliated by someone not worth her time once was bad enough. There was no way she was going to allow a second time. She had to admit Nnoitra had grown in strength, but she knew he was still not her or Hisashi's match. She had already noticed the others had wrapped up their battles and that he wasn't helping her, but she appreciated it. The humiliation she faced was the least of her concerns though. Her position in Las Noches had never been all that important to her. However, what he did to her only family Dondakaka and Pesche was unforgivable. When she was injured and in her child form, she didn't have a clue, but when she regained her true form along with her memories, she was hit by a wave of depression. If it hadn't been for everyone around her supporting her at the time, she wouldn't have known how to deal with it, how far she would have spiraled. She had practically begged Hisashi to do the same for them as he had done for her. She was willing to do anything as long as she could make things right for them. Reality had been crueler than imagined though. Hisashi had explained how he wished he could, but their situations weren't the same. While she was actually still injured and healing, even if very slowly, that wasn't the case for the two of them. Their wounds had already healed in the state they were in, and it had left them crippled. He explained his power and how it worked. How it enhanced one's innate healing factor to an insane degree, but it couldn't heal things that had already healed just in a crippled way. He had tried to reassure her about how there were many unusual powers out there and there very well could be one that could undo the damage that was done to them. He promised he would do his best. Although she felt a little better, the guilt remained. She was responsible for them. It wasn't even like she couldn't handle Nnoitra and Cielaparo. She had been arrogant though, and it had bore those closest to her an unimaginable cost. If she couldn't fix what had been done to them, the least she could do is get vengeance on their behalf. Her conscience roared at her from within. She struggled to deal with Nnoitra and Tessera's continued onslaught. They refused to give her a break or opening, slowly whittling her down. Hisashi. Mila Rose tried to get past Hisashi again. We have to help her. He's too strong. What's wrong with you? She said. He kept ignoring her pleas and stopping her from interfering. We shouldn't interfere in her battle, he said. You keep saying that. Why not? She asked angrily. Hisashi sighed. You know what Nelliel was like when I first found her, right? What Dondakaka and Pesche are still like? He asked. She calmed down a little and nodded, though her glare was still very much present. Despite most of Suruxi's attention being on the fight between two Espada that outclassed her, she moved a little closer to Hisashi and Mila Rose. Keen to hear more. And that she's originally from Las Noches. He said. She nodded again. Has she told you more about that? He asked. She shook her head. She doesn't talk about it all that much, she said hesitantly. Her eyes widened and her head jerked towards Nnoitra with a glare even fiercer than she had sent Hisashi. You mean? She asked. Exactly. Well, at least most of it. The rest was Cielaparo, he said with a slightly sinister smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. She seemed conflicted. What if she can't handle it though? She asked. He shook his head. Even if that were the case, this fight is well beyond your level, he said. But... She started to say before interrupting herself. She glared at him like she wanted to say something, but then looked at Suruxi while gnashing her teeth. Suruxi looked at him hesitantly. Are you sure about this, Jack? She asked. Hisashi smirked. Oh, so you actually do know my name? He asked. The irony that she actually didn't know his name was not lost on him. She snorted in disdain. Just don't blame me if she dies, she said haughtily. Hisashi smirked as if he knew something they didn't. She's stronger than you think, he said. 127 stomping out problems. Nelliel. Nelliel slammed her Zanpakuto into the ground with enough force to cause a shockwave that shattered the ground they were standing on and sent the duo flying away from her. It didn't manage to do any real damage, but it did buy her some precious time. She breathed in deeply and the spirit particles in the air started to come to life once again as they danced around her. She held her Zanpakuto out horizontally in front of her. Her left palm pressed against the spine of the blade. It started glowing in pink, becoming brighter and brighter as the power built. "Declare, Gamuza," she said. Finally, the collected energy exploded out like a blooming pink lotus flower, sending sand flying in all directions, blinding everyone watching. The sand quickly dispersed, revealing her resurrection. She looked like a centaur, except that her lower body was goat-like rather than horse-like and covered in light brown fur. The horns on her mask had grown and curved like goat horns, and white bone-like armor had covered most of her hands, elbows, and shoulders. In her right hand was her Zanpakuto, which was now in the shape of a large two-sided lance. She swung her lance, blowing away the remaining dust cloud. Her black tail swung, belying her calm demeanor. Nnoitra looked at her with concern. "When did you learn how to use your resurrection?" he asked. She shook her head. "I was able to all along," she said. And an unamused dry chuckle escaped his lips. "So you never took me serious at all?" he said, more as a statement of fact rather than a question. It confirmed that without his sneaky tactics he never stood a chance against her in the first place. She galloped towards Nnoitra, building up speed. In this form, her speed in a straight line was practically unrivaled, though her sideways motion was slightly hampered. It was more than worth the trade-off, though. Not only that, but the amount of power she could generate with 4 legs was also increased greatly. She swung her lance at him full force. He tried his best to deflect it with his size, but was still sent bouncing across the ground as if she swatted aside an annoying fly. All the gains he had achieved when unsealing his resurrection was undone the moment she did the same, sending him right back to how things started. He struggled back to his feet. "Do something," he shouted at the still stunned Tessera. Tessera hesitated, but eventually dashed towards Nelliel, sandwiching her between himself and Nnoitra. Unfortunately for him, once they both unleashed their resurrection forms, this had already become a fight he was unfit to participate in. She lifted her hind legs and kicked back at him without even looking at him. The moment her hooves connected with his chest, there was a loud crunching sound before he was sent hurtling back the way he came. It was unknown if he was alive or dead, but he was unable to stand back up. "Useless," Nnoitra spat out. He swung his 4 sides towards Nelliel, doing his best to overwhelm her, but she calmly parried them by rotating her lance to meet them. He tried to increase the speed of his swings even further, but it was to no avail as she effortlessly kept up with him regardless of how hard he tried. Finally, she parried harder, causing him to lose his balance. Before he managed to catch him, she spun around, swinging her lance and hitting him full force, sending him sliding backwards. Nelliel drew back her arm, holding her lance. "Lanzador Verde," she shouted as she threw the lance forward, and Nnoitra. Pink spirit power spiraled out of the tip of her lance, leaving a long trail behind it. The lance flew towards him like a spear towards its target. Nnoitra wasn't fast enough to dodge it, so he tried his best to block it by layering his 4 sides in between him and the lance. It was to no avail though, as the lance pierced through them, shattering them one by one until it struck true in the center of his chest. He was sent flying back. The tip slowly pierced his skin. Even the hero he was so proud of didn't stand a chance. The only thing it achieved was prolonging his agony as the lance continued unceasingly on its path regardless of his efforts. After dragging him back a couple miles, the lance finally pierced all the way through, continuing on until it came to a stop after hitting the go-round. Nnoitra was left standing with a gaping hole in the center of his chest. His pupils shook as he tried to come to terms with what happened, but the light in his eyes had already dimmed before he managed to. The clearing had finally become dead silent. Hisashi. Nelliel came running to him, dragging Nnoitra's body behind her like a cat bringing its owner a dead bird. She dropped it right beside him with a proud smile. Unlike those owners, he wasn't creeped out though, and thought the slightly goofy, excited grin on her face was rather cute. "Look, I brought you something," she said. He simply smiled and gave her a hug as gently as he could with his arms. "How do you feel?" he asked her. She hugged him back tightly, pressing her face into his chest while nodding. "A little better," she mumbled. After getting her fill, she quickly let go and hopped back. "Okay. Now eat it." "Eat it," she said excitedly. He chuckled and grabbed the body, rapidly converting it to pure spirit power and consuming it. He could feel the new power coursing through his body. It was by far the greatest amount of spirit power he had ever received from a single foe. It was a shame he couldn't get the experience from the kill too, but some things were more important than a little. Extra power. Mila Rose walked over to Tessera's body and poked it. He's still alive. She shouted. She dragged him back. His chest was caved in and his breathing faint, almost unnoticeable. What will we do about him? She asked. We can't leave any witnesses, Hisashi said. Suruxi nodded. That would be best. Although internal fights aren't unheard of, we aren't supposed to kill any other Arrancar, she said. 128 to the victor go the spoils. Hisashi nodded. Then we will have to take care of him after all, he said. Mila Rose seemed a little hesitant. Hisashi smiled softly. He tried his best to wrap his arms around her reassuringly without cutting her with his blades. I know you don't like it. He started. She nodded hesitantly. Nelliel came up from behind her, wrapping her arms around her too. It'll be all right. We're in this together, she said. Hisashi softly smiled at her. Although due to her instincts Mila Rose loved the hunt, she felt no enjoyment out of dealing with prey that couldn't even put up a fight anymore. However, if we let him go just because he isn't an immediate threat, he could threaten all of us down the line. First off, he might decide to get revenge and gather power himself, or find more allies. If he does, he is now aware of our capabilities and would be more prepared for another attack, he said, continued. He looked down to see her reaction. She seemed a little more relieved. Not only that, but for killing a bunch of our fellow Arrancar, our own positions in Las Noches would be threatened simply by him reporting the situation, he said. She looked down at Tessera, who was still holding on by a thread, before looking back at Hisashi with a firmer gaze in her eyes. You're right, she finally admitted. Suruxi shrugged. They would have done the same to us. They were planning on killing me right along with you just to make sure word never got back to Las Noches about what they did. They deserve the same from us, she said nonchalantly. The only thing keeping order in Las Noches wasn't some kind of camaraderie between most of the Arrancar, because that didn't exist for most of them. It was the sheer overwhelming threat provided by Aizen that kept the rambunctious Arrancar in line. If they thought they could slip something under Aizen's nose, they wouldn't hesitate to screw over their fellow Arrancar to benefit themselves. Unlike Mila Rose, who was a relatively new member of Las Noches, Suruxi, being one of the earlier members, was well aware of this. Hisashi quickly swiped one of his blades along Tessera's neck, sending a splash of blood across the ground. Within seconds, what little life was left in Tessera drained away. He didn't waste any time and started absorbing Tessera's corpse to avoid more of it being lost, as the spirit particles that it consisted of slowly dispersed into the atmosphere. Show me the muted notifications, Hisashi ordered his system. Plus 6,326,845 XP from assorted hollows. Plus 434,095 spirit power from assorted hollows. Level up x12. Plus 1 available stat points x12. Plus 11,247,724 XP from assorted Arrancar. Plus 723,492 spirit power from assorted Arrancar. Level up x21. Plus 1 available stat points x21. Plus 868,190 spirit power from Nnoitra Gilga. Hisashi sighed, seeing the missing XP from Nnoitra. Kind of a shame, but she needed this more than I needed the experience points. Even if it would have been a very nice amount, he thought before continuing down the list of notifications. Plus 8,224,898 XP from Tessera Lindacruz. Plus 564,323 spirit power from Tessera Lindacruz. Level up x13. Plus 1 available stat points x13. Hisashi smirked. Just Tessera alone gave me more than all the hollows this mission would have given me on their own. There really is no comparing the rewards regular hollows can provide me anymore when compared to the Arrancar. Such a shame I can't just start killing my fellow Arrancar left and right though. These kinds of opportunities where they serve themselves on a silver platter are too rare, he thought. Hidden mission completed. Mission: resolve Nelliel's knot. Help Nelliel resolve the emotional knot in her heart that formed after being unable to protect her Frakian from Nnoitra Gilga and Ciel Aparo Grands. Reward: Cerro Doble. His brow raised. You never told me about there being hidden missions. What's the meaning of this? He asked. Answer: some missions are intended to test the host's intentions. If the system revealed the existence of such missions, they would fail to achieve their intended meaning. In such cases, their existence is hidden from the host. For example, with this hidden mission, It was intended to test whether the host would prioritize the needs of Nelliel over his own. If the mission had not been hidden, the motivations for the host might have been due to the rewards offered rather than for the sake of helping Nelliel, and as such invalidated the purpose of the mission. Whatever. Just give me a description of the reward, he ordered. Cerro Doble. Unique ability belonging to Nelliel 2 Odelschwank. The ability allows the user to absorb an incoming Cerro by swallowing it. Then the user fires one of their own while returning the swallowed one. This results in a Cerro Doble that contains the energy of both Cerro. Okay, what about the changes during the trip here? He asked. +1 weeks to H. Plus 781,092 XP from HALLOW. Plus 38,280 spirit power from HALLOW. Plus 30,815 spirit power from spiritual energy absorption. Plus 2 level. Plus 2 available stat points. Hisashi wore a satisfied smile. Just this one fight gave me more growth than I have had in the past few months combined, he thought. Show my current status, he told his system. The familiar window popped up immediately. Equals status panel equals. Name, Saito Hisashi. Soul age, 59. Race, HALLOW. Rank, Vasto Lord. Level, 309 357. XP, 30,113 631,900. Equals stats equals. Strength, 340. Dexterity, 675. Constitution, 175. Intelligence, 265. Spirit power, 5,826,535 minus 8,485,730. Available stat points, 0 minus 48. Equals passive skills equals. Spiritual energy absorption. Ultra speed regeneration. Acidic touch. Silencioso. Equals active skills equals. Soul body separation. Spirit power concealment. Illusory aura. Blute. Energy blade. Transcribe. Hachijio Sogai. Sero. Kumin. Negation. Skill infusion. Sonido. Korinzanjutsu. Cerro Doble. Equals active missions equals. Allow the system to absorb the Hogyoku. Go ahead and put 14 points in strength, 32 in dexterity, and the rest into constitution, he ordered. Strength, 340 minus 354. Dexterity, 675 minus 707. Constitution, 175 minus 177. Available stat points, 48 minus 0. His gaze passed over what remained of the clearing. The stone temple was in pieces. The clearing had been left a mess by their battles, but there were no corpses left after Hisashi had consumed them all. He looked at Nelliel. You'll have to head back by yourself so there is as little connection between us regarding this as possible, he said. She nodded hesitantly. He smiled. I'll see you again soon, he said softly. A small smile formed on her lips. She rushed into his chest and gave him a tight hug. Again. Thank you, she said softly. When she finally let go, she quickly turned and disappeared into the forest. He turned to Mila Rose and Suruxi. Let's head back. We'll just report the mission was completed without anything unusual happening, he said. Both of them nodded in agreement. Equals Earth, Karakura Town, Ichigo equals. Ichigo had been going back and forth with Kariya. Neither side seemed to have the upper hand. To his surprise, Kariya seemed to be able to resist his Zanpakuto with his bare hands, drawing the battle out far longer than he had expected. He had been on guard the whole time, as against his expectation Kariya had yet to summon his doll. Not knowing what to expect was slowly getting to him, and he was surprised to find Kariya seemed to be able to keep up with him even without his doll. Why not meld your soul with mine? Kariya asked. Ichigo swung his blade, sending a wave of energy flying towards Kariya, but Kariya managed to dodge it. If you do, you will enjoy everlasting glory, Kariya continued. Kariya dashed towards Ichigo and swung his fist. Ichigo barely managed to block it with his Zanpakuto, but it still sent him sliding backwards from the force. How about it? Won't you entrust yourself to me? He asked. I told you. I refuse. Ichigo shouted. Kariya sighed. I see. That's too bad, he said. Kariya dashed towards Ichigo again. Ichigo drew back his Zanpakuto and spirit power started filling it. Just before Kariya managed to reach him, he swung his blade. Getsuga Tensho. He shouted. A large slash of energy flew towards Kariya. He managed to raise his arms at the last moment to block the slash. During the clash, the ornate silver cigar tin Kariya was holding was knocked out of his hand though and landed in the dirt not too far away from them. Before either of them could respond, a hand picked up the crest. A bronze and black snake was wrapped around the arm. The hand belonged to Ryo, the middle-aged male bount. He wore a light smirk while examining the ornate crest for a moment and brushed off some of the dirt. He looked up at Ichigo and Kariya. You know something interesting about us, bount. All of us have our own crest which is linked to our doll. Without our crest we aren't able to control our dolls. Without it we aren't all that different from those humans, he said with a hint of disdain in his voice. The other fights came to a halt due to the unexpected development. Kariya didn't seem too concerned. What do you think you're doing, Utagawa? He asked calmly. Ryo smirked. Kariya-san, I'll be holding on to your crest, he said. He turned to face the male bount with a mohawk. Koga-san, do you think things will go well doing things Kariya-san's way? He asked. Koga remained silent though. When he didn't get the response he was expecting and was ignored, instead he turned to the young blonde male bount. Due to Kariya-san's weakness we have already lost 3 of our own. If we continue under his lead, how long before all of us end up like that? He asked. The other bount seemed no more interested in his proposition though, instead just watching to see what would happen. Ryo started looking a little distressed. Kariya-san was in charge until now because he had power. But without this crest he has none, he said, raising the silver cigar tin for all to see. I was waiting for a chance to steal his crest. I never thought it would end up being this easy, he said. Ichigo frowned. What's this? A fight between allies? He asked. Ryo shook his head. That's incorrect. Bount are independent. We rarely help each other. We are few in number, but in order to advance to a new stage we need an excellent leader. Someone like me, not Kariya-san. He said. He was interrupted by Kariya's slow clapping while wearing a languid smile. It seems you've been biding your time, Utagawa, he said. Ryo frowned. Stop acting tough. I have your crest right here, he shouted, showing off the silver cigar tin. So what? Kariya asked. Ryo looked at him with surprise. Have you become delusional? Your crest, your source of power, is in my hands now. In other words, you are now powerless. Even that Soul Reaper boy could defeat you now, he shouted. Kariya raised his brow. Utagawa, why are you panicking? He asked. Ryo narrowed his eyes. I'm calm as always. You're the one who's panicking. Now kneel down to me as your leader, he shouted. Kariya glared at him. Don't make me say it again. So what? He asked again. Suddenly a Shinigami with short black hair wearing a sleeveless robe appeared in front of Ryo. His Zanpakuto was already unsheathed. He swung it around like the arm of a clock and the blade left behind after images as it did while spreading a radiant rainbow glow until he raised it straight up over his head. The after images slowly disappeared, but after the last one disappeared so did the Shinigami. Barely a second later the Shinigami reappeared beside Ryo, but the Zanpakuto was still missing. Ryo looked over in surprise. Before he could do anything he fell to his knees with blood spraying from various parts of his body. What? Impossible, he muttered. It's over, the Shinigami said. Finally the Zanpakuto appeared back in his hand. Ryo collapsed and didn't seem to be breathing anymore. Who? Ichigo asked. The Shinigami turned to Kariya. Master Kariya, I'm glad you're safe, he said. It's fine, Kariya said. Ichigo frowned. Hey. What the hell is a Shinigami doing here? He asked. It seems you beat Kenpeki Zareki, the Shinigami said. What? Ichigo asked. The Shinigami raised his Zanpakuto towards Ichigo threateningly. I'm X11 squad, Makiichi knows, he said. Then why are you helping the bount? Ichigo asked. There's no need for you to know, the Shinigami said. Kariya shook his head. Things seem less than favorable. We're retreating, he said. The Shinigami lowered his Zanpakuto with a sigh. Understood, he said.